Thank you.
I see the magical red light, so we're going to get started now. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening around the world. This is Doug Runke with Global Chamber. We have a really great program today, and you can see in the screen there some talented people sitting in the offices of Polsinelli law firm in Chicago, Illinois. And I don't see any women, but they are there any women in that room, gentlemen?
No, sadly no.
So the thing about cybersecurity is it impacts men and women, but for whatever reason, we've got some really talented men in the room, and I'm sure we have women all over the world watching today. We have visitors and watchers from every continent, and so, gentlemen, I appreciate you taking the time today to talk about this important topic for every business. The topic today is data breach and cyber insurance trends, and our first speaker is going to be Bruce Radke. He's a shareholder at Polsinelli. He's involved with tech transactions and data privacy practice. And so, Bruce, we appreciate you taking the time today, and why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, maybe if I can ladder over to my partner, Mike Waters, and go from there. So.
Yeah,
okay.
So my name is Michael Waters. I work with Bruce. We actually co-chair the Polsinelli Privacy and Cybersecurity Group. And a big part of what we do is help organizations out when they have a data incident. Part of our job is sort of traditional legal work. We help organizations analyze if they have any legal obligations arising out of the incident, whether that be notify impacted individuals or regulators, help them carry out those obligations. And then a big part of our job is really sort of project management. So when an organization is suffering from a data incident, oftentimes it's the first time it's gone through something like that. It can be a crisis type of situation. And there are lots of moving parts with legal and outside forensics. Sometimes we have crisis management, public relation firms involved, credit monitoring providers, call centers, mail centers. And so we will help coordinate all of those activities. What we wanted to talk about today were a few different things. One is the trends that we are seeing sort of as a law firm dealing with data breaches on a day-to-day basis. Talk a little bit about the financial implications of those trends. And then Max Perkins at Lockton is going to talk about some things that organizations can do from an insurance perspective to help mitigate against those risks. So if we go to the next slide, this is a slide that was prepared by Beasley. Beasley is an insurance company, one of many that provides cyber or data breach insurance. And this is basically a summary of the types of events that it saw over the last calendar year. When Bruce and I first got into this space, we would occasionally see situations in which companies' systems were compromised or hacked into, but a lot of the data incidents that we were seeing were really situations in which employees were making mistakes, devices such as laptops were being stolen, and with increasing frequency, we are seeing situations in which company systems are being hacked into. I can tell you that these statistics are from last year, and at this point in time, we as a law firm are seeing far greater than 50% of our matters are situations involving hacking or malware. Just in 2019 alone, I think ransomware incidents are up 200%. It has really become a pervasive problem. There are, and I guess just to take a step back, so we're just one law firm, but to talk about how pervasive this issue is, we probably get 3 to 5 new matters in the door every single day. And the type of matters that we get definitely vary. We do definitely see situations in which an employee has made a mistake or we have the lost or stolen laptop. But again, most of these situations are situations in which somebody has either hacked into or somehow impacted the systems of an organization. And there are 2 situations that we are seeing far more than any other, and those are business email compromises and ransomware events. And those are really the two types of incidents that we wanted to focus on today. So I'll be talking about business email compromises, and then Bruce will talk about ransomware. So what is a business email compromise? Well, as the name suggests, it's basically a situation in which your email account has been compromised, meaning that somebody has access to everything in your email account. They can see every email that you've sent or received. They can create rules in that email account to say, delete messages that are coming in or forward rules to their personal email account. They can send messages from your email account. And if you're able to do other things like access other parts of the organization's systems from your email account, they can do that as well. Most of these business email compromises start out as a phishing email. And the big change over the past couple of years is we used to tell people, if you are vigilant and you look closely at the emails that you're receiving, you can oftentimes spot phishing emails because the name of the organization maybe has been changed a little bit. So Polsinelli is spelled incorrectly, or instead of being an email from Polsinelli.com, it's an email from Polsinelli.net. And if you're, again, vigilant, you'll spot it and realize that there's an issue. The problem that we're seeing these days is these phishing emails are actually coming from real people's email accounts, people that you deal with on a day-to-day basis, and we'll explain why in a second. Those could be people outside your organization, or they could be people inside your organization. What's on the screen now is a sample email that one of our clients received. We all are getting more and more of these secure emails from people that we do work with, which is great. We like secure emails. But it also creates an opportunity for somebody to kind of get your credentials. So this is an email that somebody received that said, this is a secure message for you, and it's confidential with password protection. You have access to it with your working email. Underneath this would be a link that the user clicks on, and you get a little pop-up screen that asks you for your Outlook email address and password. The user enters it, and then nothing really happens. The person's a little bit confused, but just goes on about their day. On the back end, though, somebody has actually now harvested their email address and their credentials. And if that organization uses Outlook web access for email and doesn't require multi-factor authentication, the bad actor can just log into that email account. On the next screen is another sample message that somebody received. This is one that they got from somebody in-house. I think it was actually from the director of finance, saying, please complete the attached survey ASAP. You will need to log into the site using your company email address and password. We need this for insurance purposes. Again, there'll be either a document or a link. Somebody enters in their email address and their password. So at that point in time, the bad actor has, again, access to the person's email account. There are a number of things that they can do with that email account. We'll get into that in a moment. And then why this is such a pervasive problem is once the bad actor is done doing whatever they're going to do with that email account, they will almost always send phishing emails from the email account that they just compromised to everybody in that person's contact list, both within the company and outside the company. And so if you can imagine, if you have, say, 500 contacts in your contact list, and a phishing email goes out from your email account, if even 5 of those 500 people click on the link and enter in their credentials, suddenly now that's 5 more email accounts that are compromised. Same thing happens to them, 5 more email accounts. And so this problem has really been spreading like a virus, not in the traditional computer virus sense, but in the sense that once one person's affected, it winds up impacting a bunch of people. There are a number of impacts to organizations as a result of this. If we go to the next slide, some of those are listed. So we know that the primary objective of the people who are committing these schemes is to create fraudulent wire transfers. So in particular, they are trying to find people who either send wires or receive wires, and they try to inject themselves into that process. And we know this for a few reasons. One, it is very common for us to have situations in which somebody's email account is compromised and it leads to the organization sending out a wire transfer to somebody they shouldn't send it out to, and it costs the company tens of thousands of dollars, if not multiple millions of dollars in some situations. We also know that this is an issue because we can see what searches were run by the bad actor when they were in the email account, and they are almost always searching for wire or wire transfer, invoice, payroll, terms along those lines, because again, they're looking to inject themselves into the process of receiving or sending money. There are some other sort of motivations. Sometimes, particularly with executives of organizations, they want to search the email account for reconnaissance purposes, see if they can learn anything else that might be useful or valuable to them. We oftentimes see payroll redirects, and this happens in a couple of variations. Sometimes somebody may be in, say, my email account. They'll figure out who is in charge of payroll within the organization, send that person an email from the compromised email account saying, hey, I've changed my bank account information. Next payroll period, can you send my, my payroll payment to this new account? We also see sometimes where the person whose email account is compromised has the ability, using the same credentials, to actually make changes in the company's payroll system. And somebody will go in and change 100 people's direct deposit information, and the company doesn't realize it until the following week when people come in on Monday or Tuesday and start complaining that they weren't paid at the last pay period. And then finally, email accounts just have sensitive information, so that can be a motivation as well. Going to the next slide, there are definite legal and financial implications to this. So the big thing is the wire fraud, right? We, again, see situations in which organizations send out wires to fraudulent accounts because the bad actor will send an email to somebody saying we've changed our banking information. That can happen to the organization itself whose employee's email account was compromised, or it can happen to third parties. So somebody says to a business partner, hey, we've changed our banking information. Next time you pay us, send the money to this other account. And as you can imagine, that then creates a lot of tension with that business partner once they have made a payment to a fraudulent account. And as Max can get into, a lot of organizations think that they have insurance for these wire fraud situations when in fact they may not. We had a client who unfortunately felt like they had to file for bankruptcy after sending out a wire transfer for many millions of dollars. In addition, once an email account is compromised and somebody has access to everything in that email account, to the extent that there's any personal or sensitive information in that email account, you could have a data breach situation in which you have to provide notice to the individuals whose information was in the account. There are costs associated with providing those notices. There's the opportunity to be sued as a result of that, or have regulatory investigations. For those in the healthcare industry in the United States, if you go on to the Department of Health and Human Services website, they have a list of all breaches impacting 500 or more patients. And if you look at it these days, almost half of them are these email compromise situations. And all of those situations impacting more than 500 people result in a regulatory investigation by the Department of Health and Human Services. In addition, you can have lawsuits. So again, we oftentimes see situations in which somebody has lost money as a result of wire fraud, and then there's a lot of finger pointing that goes on. So this is particularly true in, say, the real estate industry. If there is a closing and somebody wires money to a fraudulent account, well, now the buyer is out that money. The seller has not received any money. It went to a bad actor sitting in another country somewhere. And they're left pointing the fingers at one another in terms of who's responsible for that money. So we're seeing lawsuits as a result. So this is both a pervasive problem and definitely a costly problem. And again, we're seeing it all the time. So I guess with that, I'll turn it over to Bruce to talk about ransomware.
Yeah, so in addition to the business email compromises that Mike has talked about, we've also seen a sharp uptick in the number of ransomware and cyber extortion events. And let me take a little bit of a step back and kind of delve into why these are occurring, because that may also impact what we do kind of moving forward. So, undoubtedly you probably received a letter from an organization whose systems have been compromised, letting you know your personal information has been compromised. So given the number, the frequency, and the size of all these different data breaches, the value of your personal information, whether it's your credit card information or social security numbers or driver's license, have decreased. So the threat actors are saying, look, we can spend a lot of time getting into systems and trying to get this information, but the value of that information in order to monetize it has decreased. So they're trying to figure out other ways to use their expertise and their tools in order to monetize their ability. And so, business email compromise is one of those for the reasons that Mike talked about. And the second is executing ransomware and engaging in cyber extortion events. So let me talk a little bit about ransomware first. And the question is, what is ransomware? So basically, it's a type of malware that will go in and encrypt files on your computer network and requires you to either do one of two things. Reach out to the threat actor who encrypted the files to obtain a decryption key, take that decryption key and then encrypt the files, or if you're lucky and you prepare for it, if you've got backups, that you can restore the encrypted files based upon backups. Now, even though you may have backups, there may be a gap from the time in which you've created the backups to the time in which the encryption occurred. So you may have lost data even in that instance. So there's two principal ways by which ransomware is executed in a system. The most common form is via an email, in which the email includes a macro that you click on the macro, in which it executes the malware, and then that malware gets executed on the system and then kind of spreads throughout the network. The second thing is through RDP ports that are either opened or compromised. And RDP ports are basically a portal on a server that is connected to the internet. And oftentimes, unfortunately, those ports may be open, no credentials, or they have very weak credentials, such that the threat actor will engage in kind of brute force password, where they'll kind of run various different types of passwords and eventually compromise those passwords and get into the network through that open RDP port. And oftentimes, once they get in, they will move laterally across the network and do various types of things, and including dropping the ransom, or dropping the to encrypt the files. The healthcare, banking, and financial services has been a prime target for ransomware, but essentially any kind of industry vertical has been impacted by ransomware attacks. As Mike said, we're probably getting 3 to 5 new matters in a day, and half of those may be ransomware events. And that's everything from retail, e-commerce, professional services, pretty much anything. Any industry that has a computer connected to the internet may be subject to ransomware. Just to give you an example, we had a situation which, the threat actors, right? They're very smart, very creative, and very wise. They will go after not only organizations but also MSPs, that's managed service providers, and using some exploits will gain access to the MSP's network, drop ransomware that will spread across all the customers of the MSPs. So if you are using an MSP, you're also a target as well. We had a situation in which A manufacturer, just to give you a little bit of an illustration about how this may impact you, had a situation in which a manufacturer was providing components, parts to the auto industry. And as part of their contract with the various auto manufacturers, they had penalties for late delivery of their products. They got hit with ransomware through an MSP. They were having difficulty they were down for essentially a week to 10 days. And during that time in which their systems were encrypted and they were down, they couldn't fulfill orders. So they were incurring all these penalties from the manufacturers when they couldn't deliver the products. Grain crab, which is one of the types of ransom that was targeting MSP, the threat actors behind that were so successful that they earned over $150 million over a course of about 18 months, and they decided they had made enough money in May that they were going to retire. So, it is the costs associated with ransomware can be very extensive and quite vast. So not only is the cost that you may need to pay the ransom in order to get your files encrypted, there's also the cost of potentially restoring your data, the cost of, kind of resuming and get your business operations back up to speed, and any kind of business interruption that may also occur. There's also the cost potentially of retaining an outside forensics firm to not only help you get kind of up to speed and get back to normal business operations, but also investigating the incident itself to determine what the threat actor did when they got into your network and whether or not any sensitive information may have been compromised, such that you may have to provide notification. And then if you do have sensitive information that's been compromised as a result of the ransomware incident, you may need to provide notification for that. And in the absence of insurance, with somebody who can help you negotiate that ransom payment, oftentimes, almost exclusively, these payments are made through electronic currency. So unless you have a Bitcoin wallet, it's very difficult to make the ransom payment. So having insurance with the panel, a vendor, a forensic firm that has the electronic currency wallet will be able to facilitate those payments. So how to prevent this, or at least minimize your risk? Number one is have good backups, and also ensure that your backups have been, there's an air gap. They're not connected to your network, because you don't want the ransomware to hit your network and then move into your backups. And I understand this may be a pretty heavy list, but the more that you can segment your network, that will contain the spread of the ransomware. And then kind of the second part that we're seeing is not as frequent, but I think sometimes quite disruptive, and that is cyber extortion. So let me give you an example. So Mike and I had a client out on the East Coast, financial services client, in which the threat actor had got into their network and downloaded all of their customer data. And when I say all their customer data, I mean all their customer data. Names, addresses, social security numbers, everything. And then the threat actor went out and started posting bits of that information on various social media sites, and then reached out to the financial institution and said, hey, we've gotten to your network, we have all your customer data, pay us X number of dollars, and we'll, number one, take that information down, but also we'll stop posting the rest of the information on the publicly available sites. It's happened quite a bit. We also had another situation, plastic surgeon out on the West Coast. Threat actor had gotten into the network and started posting before and after pictures of plastic surgery. So it's very disruptive, as you can imagine. On the first instance, not only did the threat actor reach out to the financial institution that had been compromised, but using the information that the threat actor had from the customers, started reaching out to those customers, letting them know that they had obtained the information from the financial institution and asking them to pay a small dollar amount for them to stop posting their information, but also making a request that the affected customer reach back out to the financial institution and tell them to make the overall cyber extortion payment. So quite clever, but quite disruptive. So, Max?
Wow, that's excellent. Thank you, Bruce. So first, as we, as you think about what Bruce and Michael were both saying, that's really teeing up the potential losses that are out there and the impact to the organization. And if you look at this slide, I wanted to start with this because you'll see it again later and how it corresponds to insurance. But I will say first, the most important thing is managing risk and being good stewards of your organization. And cyber is truly a governance issue. So if we're going to address an issue, I think we have to understand what the risks are, what the detailed issues and potential downsides are to events that could happen within an organization. So if you look at this wheel, you'll see that we've tried to condense the outcomes of a cyber event into one chart. And it's not, I would suggest this isn't perfect, but I think it covers almost everything. So you'll see that your cyber event sits in the middle, and then on the right side are impacts to you. That's the first party. And then there's the exposures, the impacts to third parties. And you'll see items that Bruce and Michael were talking about around privacy regulatory investigations or the costs associated with loss of confidential information on the left side. You'll see on the right side, breach event costs. That was something that Bruce was just talking about. Cyber extortions in there. And then if in the mustard color, if you look at that, you see business interruption. That's what's happening when that ransomware takes hold of your organization. And if you don't have those good offline backups to restore your network, and the data that you use, the data asset loss there that you use to run the organization, you're stuck in the mud. And so these are the good examples of the potential outcomes, the exposures that exist to a cyber event. I encourage you all to take this idea and use it as a way of exploring your business and understanding the risks associated with cyber. I think in there, I want to highlight two things before we move forward is that one, Michael alluded to theft of funds and being something that's confusing to organizations. They think that they have insurance for this. Theft of funds, keep in mind, that is taking money from your organization. And in the insurance world, that has a different implication than taking information from an organization. And then the two items that are in green there related to property damage and bodily injury, those are physical losses that can happen within an organization. And I highlight them again because when you see this in a couple slides, you'll see that they apply differently within the insurance world from how we think about them. So if we could go to the next slide, we'll talk about what is traditional cyber insurance. So I should give you a little history. Cyber insurance is not old. The insurance industry is. The insurance industry is well over 300 years old. Cyber insurance in earnest really has been around since 2010. We've been out there trying to work on it, pull it together since before the turn of the millennium, but it really didn't come to fruition until we had the confluence of regulation, privacy laws, HIPAA, California's breach notification law, and insurance underwriters who realized, okay, this is what would be impactful and helpful for organizations to buy to help to respond to a cyber event. So it starts at the top. It starts with paying for the costs associated with responding to a data breach or security incident. Data breach is a very technical word that needs to be used very carefully, as I'm sure that Michael and Bruce could explain maybe later in the question and answer section. And so this is that access to the third-party experts that Bruce was talking about and paying for those immediate costs. I would suggest that this is where cyber insurance, I think for a while, was really interesting to the insurance buyers. And actually it didn't come into full play until 2010. And that's the reason why I say cyber insurance didn't come really come around until then, because that's when the underwriters put it in, and that's when organizations started to buy. Next is cyber extortion. I listed this here because, if we were having this conversation, let's say 10 years ago, I was an underwriter back then, and I probably would have said to you, you know what, I'm not charging any money for this coverage. It never happens. And so it's good to have just in case somebody holds your system ransom. It was happening, but it was very infrequent. Now, as the gentlemen were pointing out, it's happening all the time. We see the same in our organization at Lockton. Just to make it clear, Lockton is an commercial insurance brokerage firm. We don't actually take the risk. We aren't the insurance company. We work on behalf of our clients to identify risk, manage risk, and then work with them if our clients want to buy insurance policies. So we end up seeing a lot of trends, a lot of things that happen inside and outside of insurance, similar to Bruce and Michael at Polsinelli. And the trends are very, very serious around cyber extortion and ransomware. What else does cyber insurance, the traditional cyber insurance, cover? These items that you see below, security and privacy liability issues that come up, that's a loss to a third party. Again, all of this, as you can see here, is intangible in nature. It's a financial loss. The one item that I want to point out that it doesn't seem to fit if you're thinking about cyber and hackers, media liability. Why is coverage for trademark copyright infringement included here? Well, it's because there was a time, as I mentioned, as we were trying to get people interested in this product, that we just kept throwing things in. And we threw in media liability. And I think that if you talk to many cyber insurance companies, they'd probably tell you they'd rather that be a separate line of insurance, because it's probably caused more claims than they anticipated and would like to be paying right now. And then the last is that network disruption, business interruption item, and digital asset recovery that we've been talking about all day today. I can tell you right now, stay focused on those bottom two, especially if your organization is one that doesn't touch a lot of personal information. You may think, gosh, I'm immune to cyber events because we couldn't have a data breach. We have very limited information on our employees. Actually, this down below affects almost every organization, and it's the reason why manufacturing organizations and others are starting to buy some of the largest cyber insurance towers that we see out there. Let's move to the next slide. And this is where we have a very interesting point in history with respect to insurance and cyber issues. So I highlighted two areas of traditional insurance that goes back. The property, marine, and casualty insurance go back hundreds of years. Many of them came about without any reference to cyber events. Naturally speaking, that's perfectly fine. The problem is that there's not clarity of coverage, or there had not been clarity of coverage of what if a cyber event leads to property damage? What if a cyber event, could potentially trigger my property policy, and maybe could I get some business interruption coverage out of that? Well, you will see in the news that Lloyd's, AIG, they're the two in the last week. In the past, companies like Allianz and Zurich were very clear in wanting to make sure that we provide clarity of coverage to the policyholders in these traditional lines of insurance. What that means in most cases is that they're now adding an exclusion to the policy that says we're not going to cover a cyber event in this policy. Now, it may have a card back that says, you know what, if there's a fire, an explosion, something that would traditionally be covered by property policy, okay, we'll cover that. But they're making it very clear. And what that means is that, implicitly, there is a potential loss of insurance coverage. And so I really wanted to highlight this point today for you all, because it's a question you should be asking the folks in the organization around, where does our cyber coverage end and where does it begin? And does it exist in our current policies, these property and casualty policies? And as these organizations add an exclusion, what are we doing with it? So if we could go to the next slide, I'll show you what we're doing with it. So this slide, you'll recognize the wheel again. The wheel was where we identified the risks. Now you'll see that the colors actually correspond with the key on the left. And the key on the left shows you the insurance policies where you could transfer the financial risk to an insurer. So, what all this is saying the most important thing you can do as an organization in terms, if you desire a risk transfer mechanism or a risk finance mechanism, is to make sure that you're actually doing it. And you have to align your coverages across all of these different policies, being property, marine, casualty. People refer to that as general liability. Crime, that's where the theft of funds comes in, where Michael was talking about of, sometimes people look for their cyber policy to cover that theft out of their bank account. It's actually not going to be covered out of the cyber. It's going to be covered out of crime. And then, other areas of insurance. And so I think, this is as important a slide as any, and it's really just to give you the message of let's make sure that we're aligning the coverages and that you're asking those questions of the folks who are responsible for insurance. I think with that, let's go on to the next slide and just give you a quick, kind of update on what we see in the cyber insurance market. Oftentimes insurance markets are trailing what's actually happening out there in terms of they're reacting to events. So we all know that in the property world, that's probably most notable in the news because of hurricanes and tsunamis and other events that cause physical loss. And then we expect that insurance costs will change as a result. Same thing is true in the cyber world. Are the prices going up? Well, no, not yet, but we fully expect that to change in 6 to 18 months. Why do we expect it to change? Well, some big things have happened, some of which both Bruce and Michael were talking about before. You see down at the bottom, business interruption, cyber extortion. It's happening all the time. The ransom payments that are being made are very, very big. The most recent one that I personally was involved with a client was 7 figures. And establishing the Bitcoin for 7-figure ransom payment is pretty tough. And there are very few organizations out there that can pull that together in a short amount of time. What is the average time that these incidents are taking hold? They're about 10 days. And that's a stat that's coming from a firm that we work with, and it's well known out there called Coveware. You can see the link at the bottom of the page. But in reality, I can tell you that's probably true in terms of the impact. So that's the average amount that we should really be thinking about of impact to your organization. What happens if you lose income for 10 days? And then above, you'll see that some notable areas that hit the news, that are in the news constantly. One is California, the privacy regulation that's going to take place, be effective from January 2020. I'm starting to see that in some big news organizations. I know that the gentlemen from Polsinelli are well versed in it and are very good at helping out organizations. We're trying to make sure that the insurance world is ready for that and changing policy forms where necessary to help companies who are affected by it. And similar is GDPR. And so that's where you've probably seen in the news an intention to fine Marriott and British Airways huge amounts of money. Now, that's not going to be the fine for every organization if you're involved with European data subjects, but I think it's a good example of the stick that they're willing to yield in terms of the regulators in Europe should a privacy liability event or privacy event take place. So I think all of that together just shows that, hey, look, this is a dynamic space. If you think about the past 25, 30 minutes as we've been talking, it's a dynamic space, both in, day to day, what's actually happening, where are Bruce and Michael getting involved with the clients who are calling them in need of help. And then it's also dynamic in the insurance space. And I'll tell you right now, it's what makes me interested and have fun in insurance, which is probably a traditionally boring area of the business world. So anyway, thanks so much.
Thank you, gentlemen. And I think now that everybody is scared, it's a good time for questions. I mean, I think you made very clear that what's happening is very dynamic. If you fell asleep the last year or so, it's changed even in that time. And the number that sticks to me, the 3 to 5 per day that you guys there at Polsinelli see, mostly, or at least half ransomware, that's that's terribly frightening. So, your global chamber, I guess we'd be remiss if we didn't ask about the global side of things. And so I do have some questions on that side. Anybody who's watching anywhere, if you have questions, you can either type them into the Q&A bar, or you can send it to info@globalchamber.org, and we'll be happy to answer the questions either in the next 20 minutes or so that we have, or post the event. The first question then around global, I mean, how global is this? And when we say that, it's presumably it's where are companies being impacted, which regions, and who are the actors? Are they, the Russian person or the 400-pound guy in Cleveland, Ohio? I mean, where are these people? Who are these people that are attacking these companies, and where are the companies typically?
Do you want me to take that one?
Sure. Yeah.
Sure. So both the threat actors and the companies that are being impacted are scattered across the globe. In terms of where people are located who are carrying out the attacks, there are definitely certain areas of the world where we're seeing this happen more frequently. Some countries actually have state-sponsored hackers. It's kind of common knowledge that China and Russia and North Korea, for example, do, and that in some of those countries it's sort of a 9-to-5 job, and you can actually see the incidence of hacking increase or decrease depending on the time of day it is in those countries. When these attacks happen, we can oftentimes see where the attack is taking place based on the IP addresses being used for purposes of the attack. Sometimes that can be masked, but oftentimes we'll see places like Nigeria is very common for these business email compromises, and some other places in sort of Eastern Europe and Asia where maybe in the United States at least we don't have extradition agreements. In terms of where people are who are being impacted by this, it's truly worldwide, as we saw with like Petya, ransomware. It impacted companies across the globe. In terms of cost, historically, and Max may be able to speak to this a little bit better than me, insurance has been a big focus for organizations in the United States. That's in part because we have a lot of breach notification laws. So if you have one of these incidents, you may have an obligation to let people know. There's a cost associated with that notification. And once you let people know, there's litigation and regulatory investigations that follow on that. As Max noted, we've seen developments in data privacy laws in the EU, and have recently seen fines arising out of GDPR in the EU, which I think is sort of increasing the focus for organizations in the EU on data privacy obligations. And we're starting to see countries elsewhere in the world, like Brazil and Canada and elsewhere, start to impose notification obligations on companies who have had these events. And I think once they have an obligation to notify people, that again is going to start to result in those litigation and regulatory action costs. And Max, I don't know if you want to speak to sort of insurance globally.
Yeah, sure. I think insurance globally it's interesting because actually the early buyers of business interruption were in Europe, and they were buying meaningful towers, but they were later to the table with respect to the effects from personal information and such that you were talking about, Michael. So I think you're exactly right there. In terms of the losses, these global events that you see in the news do cost in excess of $100 million just to deal with the upfront cost of incident response. And then in the longer run, it's more than that in terms of long-term liability. I think that the interesting dynamic that has been changing since NotPetya, you mentioned NotPetya, and the effect that had on the insurance buying philosophy, and that I'm really trying to make sure that we talk about with folks, is I mentioned 10 days is the average downtime for a ransomware event. Well, NotPetya was catastrophic. And a catastrophic event is generally agreed upon by technologists to be about 30 to 45 days now, based on what NotPetya did. And so what that's doing is causing that, again, goes back to governance. What is our potential loss? What is our potential business impact if this happens to us? Worst case scenario, 30 to 45 days of lost income. And so that's now where the buying mentality has shifted of these, take manufacturers or organizations where time is directly tied to the income. So I think, that's the feeling that I'm getting and seeing. I haven't, in terms of the financial impact, I think of the regulators, et cetera, I think you can just look and point to the sky. It's going to keep going up, especially California. I expect the plaintiff bar has some action, private right of action there. I think we're going to see some bigger numbers coming out in the future.
Wow. So I'll just speak about some of the things that we at Global Chamber see. Really literally every day, every few hours, we get emails. They tend to be from Russia, and they are coming in through kind of normal ways like our contact us box, and they typically have links and a variety of other things. Is that an example of potentially something very dangerous? And when companies see those things coming in, are they potentially going to have a problem if they click on some of these things?
Yeah, so I think potentially yes. And I always tell folks, the threat actors are infinitely intelligent and incredibly creative. So if they want to get into your network, there's a high degree of likelihood that they will. And whether it's through phishing emails or reaching out to you and asking you to click on a link that will execute some form of malware, the answer to that is yes. There are a variety of ways that they can get access to our network. Obviously, our employees are our first line of business, our first line of defense, and so educating those employees to the types of risk that may pose by the threat actors is a great way of reducing the chances of your systems being compromised. And it's not, it's because the threat actors continually modify, right? We get better. We stop an attack, and the threat actors continue to evolve their attacks to get around those defenses. So constantly educating your employee as to the evolving threats and trends are absolutely crucial.
Okay.
Doug, I have a couple of questions here for the group. One has to do with on email compromise and things like that in terms of Gmail. Yep. And companies that use Gmail and Google. Does that afford them any kind of protection, or is that a riskier proposition, net of what Google themselves may or may not be doing with your information?
Yeah, so I think I'm an attorney, not necessarily a security expert. I think a lot of security experts don't like having employees use Gmail from the standpoint that it's a little bit harder for the organization to implement security controls as it would be over other email systems. That being said, Gmail itself does do a number of things to help protect the security of those accounts. So for example, on business email compromises, what we'll see is the bad actor gets my email credentials. They will then log into my email account from Nigeria. If you're using Gmail, you'll get a little prompt saying somebody's trying to log into your account from an unknown computer or IP address, and that's good. Whereas Outlook, that's not standard, and that's one of the big issues. So, Gmail definitely has, decent security in place, but oftentimes you're kind of leaving it up to the employee maybe a little bit more than you would with some other email.
My other question has to do with listening to some of the discussion here this morning about, well, this is happening, it's ongoing, the actors are creative, it's a fait accompli, you're at risk, first line of defense of your employees communicating, but if you don't, it could well happen to you. If you don't have access to electronic currency transactions, you're going to be in trouble because you're going to have to make these payments. And these guys are just getting this money and getting away with it. And my question has to do with what are companies doing and are the authorities getting involved to try to fight back? not just prevent the thing from happening, but actually, I'm thinking along the lines of sting operations where we invite these actors in somehow, entice them, and then we go after them, identify, prosecute, and even convict them. Is any of that going on or happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer to that is yes, but given the sheer volume of attacks that are occurring, they're overwhelmed, right? So, we have many instances in which, law enforcement has been able to seize servers and been able to prosecute individuals when either here in the U.S. or for those folks that we've been able to bring back to the U.S. But, candidly, part of the problem is there's a lot of very bright people outside the jurisdiction of the United States, and they're operating with essential impunity. So that's kind of the unfortunate nature in which the world that we live in. Mike, I don't know if you're going to nail Max. Yeah.
I was going to say, we get some updates from the FBI. I think we're all tied into this, and it reminds me of an email that I saw now 2 weeks ago. There was an indictment unsealed of 252 people were indicted. I think 80 specific people were targeted by the FBI and arrests have been made. So they're finding these rings. But to Bruce's point, they're having a hard time, within jurisdiction, being able to go after them. They're on it. I think they're realizing this is a big issue. But
I mean, the fact of the matter is, and please don't misunderstand my statement, I mean, law enforcement is doing a tremendous job of addressing this rampant problem, but, it just underscores how important it is on us that we have to kind of take matters in our own hands and assume the threat landscape out there, so.
Yeah.
Okay. And then from a global perspective, just along that line, can you talk to international agreements or organizations, be it the UN or others, that are also coming together to try to address this? You mentioned the EU-US. Are there other international or global groups that are trying to identify and combat this and educate and deal with this issue?
Interpol. I was thinking Interpol.
Yeah.
Anyone know?
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so there are organizations like Interpol. We also definitely see cooperation between law enforcement in different countries. So, for example, on the business email compromises and wire fraud, one thing we commonly see is when somebody sets up that fraudulent bank account, it will be in Hong Kong for some reason is a common one. And in situations involving larger wire fraud transfers, if you call the FBI in addition to your bank, they will be active in trying to help terminate that transaction, get those funds refunded, and they will work with law enforcement in Hong Kong to try to sort of work with the banks over there to help facilitate that process. So we are definitely seeing law enforcement work together in different jurisdictions. But again, a lot of these schemes are being perpetrated by people in countries that honestly sort of want the business. They like having people there that are making money and aren't going to extradite.
Always looking the other way, sure. Kate.
I have a question. I've helped clients, smaller clients, with global real estate transactions, and we had typically had a third-party online provider, not a bank. I'm wondering, thinking, maybe that wasn't such a good idea. Some of those shops have sprung up over the last few years because they're cheaper than banks. But what's your thoughts on the exposure around those third party? There's different types. There's an Irish company that sets up banks all over the world. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on third party money transfer companies that are not banks.
Yeah, I mean, I think
like OSS I think that was the one that we used to recommend, but there's various ways that money's transferred.
Yeah, I mean, I think,
kind of due diligence you recommend.
Going back even like for traditional real estate transactions where the threat actors have targeted closing, agents and getting into email accounts and looking at kind of the flow, and then at the time in which those funds are going to be transferred to close the deal, send out a fraudulent email from the compromised account saying instead of sending the proceeds of the transaction to the Bank of America account, to the threat actor's account somewhere else. I mean, I think that same kind of attack mechanism could also be employed in those other third parties. So, and again, they're also going to be vulnerable to having their email accounts compromised as well. Max, Mike, I don't know if you've got other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. It's just anytime you're working with a third party, it's an extension of you, and I would not make assumptions that they're doing the basics. And so if you're going to be using a third party, you make sure that they're, going through authentication, not just an email, not just making sure that the bank accounts are good by email, but that they're actually, you're talking to the people who are on the other side of it to confirm that you're testing the wires, all of the basic steps that you would take in a world before technology that you're taking now. Yeah.
But it sounds like, excuse me, from what you've said today, that Bitcoin isn't even necessarily a secure way, or is that the way that these actors are not necessarily Bitcoin, but any cryptocurrency? Is that the most foolproof or way to transfer money, way to transfer value?
Bitcoin's incredibly secure. It's pretty amazing. And it is, it's anonymous, right? And, that's the reason why the threat actors want to use it, is because it's very hard to trace. It's very easy to move things around on their side, go in and out of accounts. And it can't be traced. But it is, is it secure? Yeah, as long as you know who you're dealing with on the other side of it. I'm not sure that I would do a real estate deal in Bitcoin, because you're exposing yourself to unbelievable pricing volatility. And so I would only deal with Bitcoin issues when you have to.
It's happening.
Is it?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yep. But again, how do you assess risk? The governance, it gets back to governance. It's a fun world we live in.
It is. It is. It's amazing real estate transactions are happening in Bitcoin, because to me, I'm not sure I guess it's accepted, it's recognized by governments and by, the banks, the international banks, et cetera, but I'm not sure it's encouraged or welcomed or regulated yet. So I'm not sure.
It's not. That's.
Yeah, and to Max's point that, there are always developments in technology, but it's always good to fall back on sort of the due diligence and administrative precautions that you have in place. I think it certainly applies to real estate closing. So, somebody these days can go in and they can change bank account information, but just, day of closing, somebody picking up the phone, talking to, a known person on the other end to confirm the information before that wire goes out, not allowing changing of bank account information unless certain hoops are jumped through. Things like that, I think, are things we can always fall back on.
A lot of small-time, not necessarily small amounts of money, but small private investments are done in cash around the world. So that's why it's emerging, and I'm just trying to get my head around it, quite frankly. So I appreciate this conversation.
And Doug, just for the record, that's those comments and questions are coming from Catherine Minnie, one of our Global Chamber Chicago Advisory Board members, who brought a little gender diversity here to our group sitting around the table, in case you didn't notice.
Fantastic. And I apologize for not meeting you originally, Ernie. That's Ernie Watts, Executive Director for Global Chamber Chicago. So, Ernie, I want to thank you for putting this together. You guys can continue your conversation there in terms of the Globinar. We're right at 60 minutes, and so we're going to cut out here, but continue your conversation. I'd like to thank Bruce and Michael from Polsinelli. You guys are just a great partner. We really appreciate your collaboration, and particularly today, your expertise. This has been hopefully very enlightening for a lot of people. We're definitely going to be making sure that people have your access to your information so that they can get a hold of you. We'll be posting a blog post next week that people will be able to reach out to you. And then if anybody has, needs to talk to you today, again, info@globalchamber.org. We're happy to connect you. And Max, thank you for your time as well. We appreciate on the insurance side. Sounds like there's a lot of things that owners and leaders need to be thinking about today that they didn't necessarily need to think about 10 years ago, per your point, where, hardly ever happened 10 years ago, but now it's happening very often. So thank you, three. Thank you, everyone there in the room. Thank you for everybody calling in over the network around the world. Our next events are tomorrow. We have a Growing Around the World session with Professor Ansis, and then in 2 days we have a League of Extraordinaries event in Spanish, and we have one of those in English next week. So we have 1 to 2 or more events every week at Global Chamber. We really try to get meetings and information and educational info that is helpful for business leaders as they grow, and today has been spectacular. So again, thank you for everybody and have a great day. Take care, everybody.